Hello friends, we are back for week 3 of the Bloom Along, and this week we're doing all things half square triangles, also known as HSTs. We will be piecing these lovely little blocks together. Half square triangles are really like a foundational skill required to do quilting because there are lots and lots of half square triangles in all kinds of quilts. So here are my tips and tricks for how to put these pieces together. Have fun. Have fun. We're starting to piece. It's starting to come together. I'm really excited. Let's get going. Hello. Today we're talking all about half square triangles. We're going to start sewing, which is fantastic. We've spent 2 weeks prepping and cutting, and now we're ready to sew. So we're going to start with the simplest part of this entire pattern, and that is half square triangles. They're really pretty easy, and those of you who have sewn HSTs before, once you've done it a few times, it's not difficult. For those of you who are newer to quilting, they're also pretty straightforward, but I'm going to give you a few little fun tips on how to make HSTs work for you. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do is to print out your quadrant layout for the version that you're doing. I'm doing the Bloem 1 and I'll be making the large version, but once I have this printed out, this really helps me look up where all my half square triangles are, and I'll be making those blocks. And then as I make those blocks, I can just mark these off on here, just do a little check mark so I know which blocks I've made as we progress through the quilt pattern. So before we talk about actually putting them together, I just want to go over the measurements. If you are making the medium size quilt, which is the 48 by 48 inch quilt, for all the blocks in your layout, blocks with 4 units, each of those units should measure 3.5 by 3.5 inches before you put them together. Okay, so your 2 magic measurements are 3.5 by 3.5. That's what you're aiming for. And then your other measurement is 6.5 by 6.5 for units that are just a single block. Okay, once you get these 4 together, they should also measure 6.5 by 6.5. So that's for the medium size quilt. That applies to all blocks. All right. When you're putting these 4 units, before you put them together, just measure, make sure they're 3.5 inches each. You're making the large quilt, the 64 by 64 inch quilt. All your blocks that have 4 units, those units should measure 4.5 by 4.5 before you put them together. Okay. And then once you've got them together, they should measure 8.5 by 8.5. And the same goes for the solid unit. If this is a single block, it's 8.5 by 8.5. When I'm talking about 4 units versus 1, what I mean is, I'll show you an example. Here, this top A1 block, that's 1 block, right? This block A2 is made up of 4 smaller units that have to be sewn individually, trimmed, and then put together. So this is your single block unit. This is your 4 unit block, okay? So that's what I mean by that. These are your magic measurements for large, 4.5, 8.5. And again, medium, 3.5, 6.5. That's what you're going for before everything gets sewn together into one big quilt, all right? I'm going to impart a little bit of quilt magic, AKA math, to you in case you don't know this. And it's just a handy tip, and that's why you'll understand now how these measurements work here on this cutting page. Okay, so any half square triangle where the unfinished, that means before you've put it into the entire quilt, the unfinished size you're aiming for is X1/2, so 3.5, 4.5, 5.5 inch HST. The starting square or squares are X 7/8 of an inch. So 3 7/8, 4 7/8, 5 7/8. And you can see that's on your cutting instructions. That's what I've got here. 8 7/8, 6 7/8, 4 7/8, 3 7/8, right? That's your starting number for a square. So let's have a look at this one. Just pretend it's still a square. This square measures 4 7/8 of an inch. I slice it in half to make 2 half square triangles. I do the same with another square. Once I put those together, when I open them up, that's going to measure 4.5 inches. Okay, so 7/8 of an inch is your starting point for any HST, so that when you put it together, it's X1/2 inches when it's unfinished. The other option here, alternatively, especially if you're newer to sewing or you're not 100% sure about your 1/4 inch accuracy, is that you can just round up. So for your starting square, instead of cutting 4 7/8 of an inch, it's just 1/8 away from a full rounded measurement. So instead, I could cut 5-inch squares, slice them up, put them together, and I'm going to get something that's either 4.5 inches or slightly larger. That's where I want to trim this down to 4.5 inches. Okay, so you can always round up as well. So in those cutting instructions, I've given the exact 7/8 measurements to starting squares, but you could round this up to 9, and this one to 5, this one to 7, that one to 4. Okay, and then once you get the HST, the pieces together, then you trim each unit down. All right, so that's just a little bit of quilt magic math. 7/8 transfers into a 1/2 inch unit once you've put those together. Slice, sew it together. All right, it's a good little handy thing to know, especially if you're like designing your own quilt and you're trying to figure out the measurements. All right, let's talk about piecing HSTs together. It's pretty straightforward. Got a little stack of cut half square triangles here. Number 1, I really like to use a flanged foot. This foot has a little flange on the side of it so that I'm sewing exactly at 1/4 of an inch. Hopefully, even with the flange, sometimes machines aren't 100% accurate. So I recommend putting a piece of, just a piece of scrap through and then measuring your seam allowance. It should be 1/4 of an inch. If it's not, some machines have the ability to adjust the needle to the left or to the right, just a touch. If your machine can do that, then adjust it accordingly. If your machine can't do that, then I recommend using a piece of washi tape or tape and marking along your machine where your accurate 1/4 of an inch is, okay? Accuracy is always helpful in quilting, and so that's one of the first basic steps you should do. Okay, so I've got my triangles here, and I'm working on these units here, this A3 and C1. Those are all little HSTs, and I'll be pairing those up accordingly, okay? And then there's some more there, here. There's another one there. So those are all my HSTs that I can sew today, and I can leave it at that, or I could put these units together. I will show you how to put these units together today if you want to do that step, okay? If you're not ready for it or if you don't have time, just get the individual units together today and then work on it, putting these units together at a later date. Okay, so I'm going to work on these, and my BK is background, okay? Background color. My background color is this pink, and I'm pairing it with this teal and green. So I want right sides together. And once you pin a stack of these, you can then go and chain piece them through your machine. So I like to get them all pinned and then take them over to my machine, sew them all at once. Okay, so I need to be really nice and accurate about lining these up. Then I'm taking my pins, and a lot of people pin this way. If that's what you're comfortable with, go ahead and do that. I pin where I sew, so I'll put a pin in here, and then I remove those pins as I'm sewing. But I pin where I sew because it's connecting more of the area where I'm actually sewing. So this pin is holding 2 points along my fabric where I'll be sewing rather than just 1 point this way, okay? So I'll put pins in these, and then I'll take them all to my machine and I will sew them using 1/4 of an inch. I'm not going to show you that part because it's pretty straightforward, but I will give you a handy tip. One of the frustrating things for some people on some machines is that some machines like to eat those points Like as you're getting your first HST into the machine, some of them like to go and suck that down, okay? And that's not fun. So I recommend when you start chain piecing, as soon as you start putting one of these in, first start with just a little, what's called a leader. And a leader, fancy name for a scrap. And you can reuse these scraps over and over. So I'll put my presser foot down, I'll start sewing along the leader, and after I've got the leader through, I feed in my first HST, and magically it doesn't get sucked down by the machine. So that's just a little handy tip. Okay, now I've got this nice stack of sewn half square triangles, and I haven't ironed them yet. What you can do optionally is trim these corners off before you even iron them open. Sometimes I do that, and what I do is I just take scissors and I trim at 45 degrees like this, and then when I open them I don't have any dog ears. Does it save time? I don't know, but I like to trim before I do that. Otherwise, when you sew or iron your HSTs together, when you iron it, you're gonna have these little dog ears and you just have to trim them off afterwards. Either way works, okay? So with these, I am just ironing to one side. I'm not ironing the seams open. Ironing to one side works for these blocks, and because this is a light pink and this is a darker fabric, I've ironed all the seams to the darker side, and I just want to press in there, finger press a little bit, and use a nice hot iron and press straight down. You don't have to do this with your iron because then you start to distort things, right? So just nice flat pressing, okay? If you have a tailor's clapper, go ahead and use the clapper to press your seams. But if you don't have one of those, that's fine too, okay? So we do a stack of those. Before I put them together, because these are 4-unit blocks, before I put them together, I need to make sure that they're the right size. They might need some trimming. So here's how you can trim these up. First, get your rotary. Make sure you've got a really nice sharp blade in that rotary. And for me, these should be measuring 4.5 inches each, right? Because I'm making the large. Again, if you're making the small or the medium size quilt, this should measure 3.5 inches, okay? So I've got a 4.5 inch block lock ruler, and I'll show you how to use that. If you don't have a fancy block lock ruler, just use your regular ruler and trim down all the way around to 3.5 inches or 4.5 inches, okay? So if I'm using a regular ruler, I'm taking this. This is a 1/2 inch increment ruler, so I just have to make doubly sure, depending which way you rotate this ruler, you're either getting whole inches or 1.5 inches. So this is 4.5 by 4.5. If you're doing a lot of these, you might even want to take a little piece of washi tape and just put tape on your ruler to mark your markings, so you don't have to, recheck every single time where you're cutting. And so there's 4.5 inches. Here's my 45-degree line, and I can set that right down along the seam. I don't have to trim this one. It is pretty accurate, but I can trim that off. Okay, there. So I didn't have to trim this. I can trim this other dog ear off. That's with a regular ruler. And then if you're using something like a block lock ruler, which they come in sets, or they come, I don't know if they come individually, they have all kinds of different rulers. The block lock has this special groove cut along the back. You can see it's got a groove, and you can bump that up. Especially, it works best if you've ironed to one side. You can bump that groove up against the seam. And see, it just sticks right there. It's accurate. And then, look at, I can trim a little bit. And then you trim away, okay? Block locks are an investment. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, but people kept telling me I needed to buy these because I make a lot of HSTs, and it's true, they're very handy. One of the things I did do with this ruler, and with most of my rulers, is add these little non-slip stickers to the backs so my rulers don't slip around. These ones, this is a Creative Grids brand ruler. All the Creative Grids rulers already have that built into the ruler. It's this like little rough spot so that it doesn't slide around on the fabric. Okay. All right, so trim up your half square triangles to 3.5 or 4.5 inches, and then we'll put them all together into these units. I'll show you how to do that next. Okay, I've got my HSTs trimmed and ready to be sewn into these units. So I'll focus on A3 for the Bloem one, and C1. If you're doing the other Bloem 2, then you'll have to figure out which blocks you're working on. But this is, we'll focus on this one first. And I'm using 4, 5, 5, 4, 4. So color 4 and 5, I have to discern which is which. Color 4 is this one, and 5 is the green. Got my little handy chart there. So number 4B is going to look like this. And then the other 4B goes in this direction. The easiest way to deal with these is to just lay them out before you do anything at your machine. There's 4, and then 5 goes like this, and the other 5 goes like this. Okay? And then, so that's A3. C1 is a mirrored version of this. See how all of these are mirrored? Mirrored, 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 mirrored. Some of them doesn't make a difference, but these ones are opposites. So you'll want to focus on laying these out the right way. So C1 looks like this. It's going to go 4B goes this way and this way. Nope. This way and goes this way and this way. And technically, if I were to flip this around like this, you can see it's the opposite, okay, to this one. So we'll put these halves together first. So this one goes to this one, and this one goes to this one. And then we'll put our pins in and sew at 1/4 inch seam allowance. And don't iron them yet. I want to show you the ironing trick for these HSTs so that you can get really nice points when you're finishing this block. Okay, so let's get these sewn together and then we'll talk about ironing. All right. My units are sewn together, okay, and before I iron them, here's a little tip. We're going to iron to one side, but we're going to do opposite directions so that we can nest the seams in the center so we don't lose our points. See how we want to be able to see this point, so we've got something to look at while we're sewing these halves together. So I want to iron this seam towards this solid triangle and away from this point. I'll just give it a finger press. And then this one is going to go in the opposite direction. Okay. Iron to one side. And then that way, when we flip this over, we can see that point and these stitches here. And I'll show you why that matters, or why that's helpful. Okay, so with my seams ironed in opposite directions, now when I flip this over and pair these up, two things can happen. I can nest the seams together, meaning I can bump these seams up against one another so that they line up really nicely. Okay, and then the second thing that happens is that with this, you can see a stitch going this way and a stitch going on the diagonal. That's your point in there. Right? And you don't want to lose it, ideally. It's okay if you do. It's not gonna ruin everything, but for accurate points, when you're stitching along here, you want to hit that X marks the spot. You don't want to go over it because you'll lose the point. If you go far away from it, you'll have more than enough, but you want to try and hit that X. So I'm going to line these up like this. The seams are just bumping up against each other, nesting into one another, not overlapping. And then I'll use a couple pins. I'm going to pin here and here, and then through the center. Another way to line this up is to take your pin, put it through that little X, and make sure it's going through the X on the other side as well, because there's an X marks a spot on both sides. Okay, that side, that side. Take that pin, flip it like this, and then we're going to sew these, and we'll see how our points turned out. Okay, halves are sewn together, and when we open this up, you can see our points are lined up nicely. Everything is lined up quite well. All right, now the only downside is this little chunk here. It's got quite a bit of bulk. So up to you, you can either iron this center seam to one side, or if you'd like, you can iron it open. It's totally your choice, all right? And then that unit is finished. If you're new to quilting, or even if you're a seasoned quilter and you open this up and your points aren't perfect, look at it and say, is this good enough for me? Is this going to bother me? If it's going to bother you, then get that stitch ripper out, try again. If you can live with it and you're like, no, that's great, I finished it, I'm proud of myself, then move forward, okay? Don't let anything like that stop you from enjoying the process and enjoying sewing, okay? Just keep going, all right? The more you work on these, the more sewing you do, the more accurate you get. It's all with practice, and honestly, finished is better than perfect. That's what we always say in the quilting world. Not only should you mark this off on your chart, you should also label your finished blocks as you go. It'll be so helpful when we get to the final assembly point, right? So this one is A3. I'll be making 4 of those. So I could stack them all together and pin them together, or I could label them individually, but no matter what, A3, A3, and then this one is C1. And honestly, you can use tape, you could use a little piece of paper. Look away, I'm using these fabric scissors because they're right here, and I know this is a big no-no to cut paper with fabric scissors. Just pretend you didn't see that. Okay, there's A3. I'll take a pin. I'm always orienting it the same way as in this layout, and I'm putting the pin in the top left corner for every single block, depending on where it sits in the layout. Here's C1. Making sure it's laid out properly, putting it in the top left corner. And then that way, you've got everything labeled. You're not going back and looking at a stack of blocks and going, oh my gosh, which is which, where goes what, blah, blah, blah. Staying organized throughout this whole quilt really, really does make it so much easier. So that's HSTs. Those are fairly straightforward, I think. If you have questions, put them down below, or you can ask them during our live session this week. And next week we'll be doing the hourglass and birds in the air blocks. Again, it's more triangles, so we're not touching those curves just yet. We're working our way up to those, and I know you can do it. All right, that's it. Happy sewing!